Casefile 05. The Anomalous Acoustic Anomaly of Blackwood Forest. This case file concerns a recurring acoustic report associated with Blackwood Forest. It remains active not because the sound has intensified or become more disruptive, but because repeated attempts to classify, measure, and resolve it have failed to produce a durable administrative conclusion. Across more than 4 decades of records, the sound itself is described with notable consistency. It is referenced as low in frequency, rhythmic in character, and geographically confined to a defined area of woodland. What changes over time is not the description of the sound, but the manner in which responsibility for it is transferred, diluted, and eventually assumed to have been settled. This file does not attempt to determine what the sound is. It documents how the system responded to it. 1. Forestry records, initial containment. The earliest references appear in Forestry Service incident logs dated between 1978 and 1981. These logs are operational and handwritten, recording routine matters such as trail obstruction, fence damage, unauthorized vehicle access, and minor disturbances reported by staff or visitors. The sound is first noted under a general heading labeled Miscellaneous Disturbance. The entry records a location within the southern quadrant of the forest, an estimated duration of approximately 20 minutes, and an occurrence during early evening hours. No instrumentation is used, and no attempt is made to measure the sound beyond basic observation. A marginal annotation suggests that the disturbance is likely environmental in origin, without further elaboration. At this stage, the classification is sufficient. Forestry services do not record an obligation to pursue environmental noise unless it interferes with operations, safety, or protected habitats, none of which are considered applicable. The matter is logged and closed. 2. External complaints and reclassification. The anomaly re-enters the system several years later through a different route. In the mid-1980s, environmental health departments in neighboring districts begin receiving formal noise complaints from residents living adjacent to Blackwood Forest. These complaints are procedurally distinct from forestry logs, as they are initiated externally and carry defined response obligations. The complaints vary in phrasing but converge in substance. Residents report a recurring sound, primarily during evening or nighttime hours, which they state does not correspond with traffic, weather conditions, or nearby industrial activity. Environmental health officers apply standard nuisance protocols. Case reference numbers are assigned, acknowledgement letters are issued, and initial assessments recommend monitoring rather than enforcement. Forestry services are notified that a potential source area has been identified within the forest boundary. Responses reference existing incident logs and state that no active operations or installations are present that would account for the reports. At this point, the anomaly becomes shared rather than owned. It is no longer exclusively a forestry concern, but it has not yet become an environmental enforcement issue. 3. Introduction of acoustic measurement. In 1989, Environmental Health commissions an external acoustic contractor to conduct overnight monitoring within the forest perimeter. The commissioning documents specify monitoring across 2 consecutive nights, with a focus on low-frequency noise detection using passive recording equipment and reporting in accordance with prevailing environmental standards. The contractor invoice confirms deployment of equipment and staff time. A written summary report follows. The report states that a recurring sound was detected during monitoring windows, that its frequency fell within the lower audible range, and that the source could not be confidently isolated using the deployed methodology. The report references an accompanying audio recording. No audio file is attached to the version retained in the central archive. An internal note records that the audio is held by the contractor. No request for transfer or duplication is logged. 4. Procedural weight of recorded evidence. Following the introduction of acoustic recording, the tone of subsequent correspondence begins to shift. New complaints received in the early 1990s are no longer treated as first-instance issues. They are cross-referenced to earlier case numbers and contractor assessments. Standard response letters evolve accordingly. Earlier correspondence informs complainants that the matter is under review. Later versions state that the issue has been previously assessed and found to require no further action. The distinction is subtle but consequential. Assessment implies active engagement, previous assessment implies closure. Audio recordings are now referenced as evidence that due process has occurred, despite not being revisited or re-examined. 5. Repeated surveys and narrowing scope. Between 1994 and 2002, at least 4 further acoustic surveys are commissioned by various departments, often triggered by renewed complaints or periodic reviews. Each subsequent survey exhibits a narrowing of scope. Monitoring periods shorten, methodologies rely increasingly on prior conclusions, and reports reference existing recordings rather than generating new interpretive frameworks. One internal memorandum notes that further recording is unlikely to yield materially different results, citing consistency across earlier assessments. Despite this, 2 additional surveys still deploy recording equipment. Both confirm that audio was captured. Neither provide audio files to the central archive. Instead, summaries are retained, and those summaries are treated as sufficient proxies for the recordings themselves. 6. Responsibility drift across departments. By the early 2000s, the anomaly occupies an ambiguous administrative position. Forestry services consider it an environmental noise matter. Environmental health treats it as a historical case with no actionable escalation. Planning authorities reference it only in the context of environmental assessments. A planning consultation file dated 2004 notes the existence of a known acoustic anomaly and concludes that no mitigation measures are required for proposed development near the forest boundary. The justification cites earlier surveys and assessments. No evidence suggests that the planning reviewers accessed or reviewed any underlying audio material. The anomaly is now stable by precedent rather than resolution. 7. Audio as institutional abbreviation. From this point forward, references to audio recordings become increasingly abstract. Later correspondence includes phrases such as recorded previously, audio evidence exists, and sound documented. These phrases function as administrative shorthand, signaling that the issue has been handled without restating how. The recordings themselves are no longer discussed as artifacts with location, format, or custodianship. They are treated as conceptual evidence rather than physical records. Authority migrates from data to documentation. 8. Archival degradation and silent loss. In 2011, a records management review identifies multiple legacy media holdings as inaccessible due to format obsolescence and incomplete transfer records. Among the affected items are audio files associated with environmental surveys conducted in the 1980s and 1990s. The Blackwood Forest anomaly is listed by reference number only. No itemized recovery attempt is recorded. The review notes the loss and recommends no corrective action, citing the age of the material and the inactive status of the associated cases. Subsequent documents continue to reference the recordings without acknowledging their absence. The system adjusts without disruption. 9. Renewed complaints and procedural misalignment. Following the archival review, the anomaly does not immediately reappear in the file. Instead, it surfaces indirectly. Between 2013 and 2016, new noise complaints are logged by environmental health teams using updated case management systems that do not fully integrate legacy records. As a result, the anomaly briefly exists in two administrative states at once. In newer systems, it appears as a fresh complaint requiring initial assessment. In older archives, it remains classified as a historically assessed issue requiring no action. This misalignment produces contradictory responses. In at least two recorded cases, complainants are informed that the matter is both under investigation and previously resolved, depending on which reference number is consulted. No reconciliation note is added. 10. Attempts to re-establish context. Internal correspondence from this period shows officers attempting to orient themselves within the file. Emails request clarification on prior conclusions, confirmation of survey dates, and access to earlier acoustic material. Responses are limited. In one exchange, an officer notes that conclusions appear to rely on audio evidence that is no longer accessible. The reply states that summaries should be sufficient and that reopening historic assessments would not be proportionate. The question is not answered. It is bypassed. The case continues to progress without re-establishing its evidentiary foundation. 11. The problem of re-recording. A key moment occurs during a 2017 internal review meeting. Meeting notes record a discussion about whether new recordings should be commissioned, given the absence of earlier audio. The proposal is considered and rejected. The reasoning is procedural rather than technical. Prior assessments concluded no actionable issue. Commissioning new recordings would require redefining scope. Redefining scope would imply earlier insufficiency. The meeting concludes that new recordings could undermine confidence in existing decisions. No further discussion is recorded. 12. Secondary reliance on tertiary material. From this point onward, references to the anomaly increasingly rely on material several steps removed from the original evidence. Later documents cite summaries of reports. Reports that cite earlier summaries. Conclusions derived from documents that reference recordings. The anomaly becomes supported by a chain of interpretation rather than observation. No document explicitly acknowledges this shift. The language remains confident. 13. Normalization through repetition. As the years progress, the anomaly becomes administratively routine. When raised, it triggers a predictable sequence. The file reference is confirmed. Historic assessments are cited. Closure language is issued. The process functions efficiently. Its efficiency becomes its own justification. One internal note remarks that the issue has never escalated, without addressing whether escalation was ever structurally possible. 14. Quiet institutional acceptance. By the early 2020s, the anomaly is no longer treated as unresolved. It is treated as understood, despite the absence of primary material. New staff inherit the file with minimal briefing. They encounter conclusions without evidence and are instructed to proceed accordingly. The absence of recordings is no longer unusual. It is expected. The system adapts around the gap rather than correcting it. 15. The final administrative position. The most recent case entry does not concern the sound itself. It concerns workload prioritization. An internal review lists the Blackwood Forest anomaly among low-impact, historically assessed issues that do not warrant active management. The justification cites duration without escalation. Consistency of complaint description. Absence of measurable harm. The absence of evidence is not listed as a factor. The file remains open by classification only. 16. Closing summary. This case file does not describe a sound that disappeared. It describes how the loss of evidence did not interrupt decision-making, but reshaped it. Once recordings were no longer accessible, the system chose stability over re-examination. Each subsequent action reinforced earlier assumptions. Each attempt to question them was redirected toward precedent. The anomaly persists because resolving it would require acknowledging that, for a significant period, decisions were justified by material no longer available to those making them. Casefile 05 remains open. No further action is scheduled.